Have you ever done something unexpected? Something that made you wonder, that's not me. Where did that come from? Or have you ever had a new insight? A thought that put life in perspective. A thought not your own. If you've ever had experiences like these, you may have been inspired. The word inspired comes from a Latin word. It literally means to breathe into. Jews and Christians alike hold Scripture is inspired by God. He breathed into human authors to communicate His message. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, God inspired the human authors of the sacred books. To compose the sacred books, God chose certain men who, all the while He employed them in this task, made full use of their own faculties and powers, so that, though He acted in them and by them, it was as true authors that they were consigned to writing whatever He wanted and no more. In other words, the authors wrote down their thoughts and opinions and experiences, but God made sure their products communicated His truth, a truth necessary for salvation. In this video, we'll investigate the Bible, the different types of Bible, some of the translations available in English, and some editions that address a particular need. In English-speaking regions, there are 4 types of Bibles, 1 Jewish and 3 Christian. The latter 3 depend upon different denominations, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Protestant. The differences in Christian Bibles depend upon their recognized number of inspired books. All the Christian Bibles contain 27 books found in the New Testament. No one doubts this number. The differences depend upon the number found in the Hebrew list. To explain these differences, we need to take a look at some history. First, let's consider the Hebrew Scriptures, commonly called the Tanakh. This is an acronym for the 3 divisions in their Bible. T is for Torah, or the Jewish law. N is for Nevi'im, or the prophetic books. And K is for Ketuvim, or the other books called the writings. The Torah has 5 books, the Nevi'im has 8 books, and the Ketuvim has 11 books. So there's a total of 24 books. When did this list, also known as the canon, become set? The book of Daniel was composed in the early 2nd century BC. Sometime over the next 400 years, Jewish leaders began to close the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures. Scholars argue approximately when this process occurred, but the definitive list did appear by the early Middle Ages, when rabbis began to standardize pronunciation, chapter and verse, and cantor notes for worldwide use. Their efforts produced what we now call the Masoretic text. In the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible is called the Law and the Prophets. This implies that there was a list of books that were grouped together, but does not indicate when that list was final at that time. Before we turn to the Christian Bibles, let's consider another list of the Hebrew Scriptures. By the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East. Along the way, he spread the Greek language, culture, and commerce. This influence would last almost 1,000 years. Over time, ancient Jews who lived outside of Palestine acquired Greek as their first language and lost the ability to understand Hebrew. So there was a need for a definitive Greek translation. Between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, translated the core of the Tanakh into Common Greek. Between the 2nd century BC and the early 1st century AD, some books like Daniel and Esther were expanded and others were added. This translation became known as the Septuagint. It contained 53 books. The Septuagint was influential and widely used. It replaced the Hebrew Tanakh for Jews outside of Palestine. The differences between the ecumenical, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestant Bible depend upon the tension between the Tanakh and the Septuagint that developed over the centuries. Early Christians evangelized and worshipped in Greek. The New Testament was written in that international language, so it's not surprising that it adopted the Greek Septuagint as its source for the Hebrew Scriptures. Even today, many Orthodox Christians consider the Septuagint as definitive and divinely inspired. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire split into two cultural spheres, Greek in the east, Latin in the west. By this time, the faithful in the west needed a Bible translation in their language, so Pope Damascus I commissioned a scholar named Jerome to revise the Latin translation of the Bible. Jerome moved to Palestine and began to translate the Old Testament not from the Greek Septuagint, but from the Hebrew. He believed the Septuagint was inferior because of translation errors, but he did translate many of the books found in the Septuagint. Over time, many of these books were included in his translation. Jerome's translation became known as the Vulgate. By the time of the Reformation, the Church had standardized the list of books found in the Vulgate. It became the official Bible text for the Roman Catholic Church. Why did the Catholic Church keep some of the books from the Septuagint? Throughout the history of the Church, almost all church leaders and scholars considered the Hebrew list in the Tanakh superior. These were called proto-canonical, or the primary list of writings. But the books in the Septuagint were useful for liturgical readings and for personal spiritual growth. They were an integral part of the missionary efforts in the early church. So these were called deuterocanonical, or a secondary list of writings. By the time of the Reformation, the church had problems. Reformation leaders like Martin Luther and John Calvin believed many of these problems could be solved by asserting the primacy of the Bible. So they turned to the Tanakh and they rejected the Septuagint books for three reasons. First, the Tanakh copies in circulation were the most reliable Hebrew text at that time. Second, deuterocanonical implied an inferior status, so they were not needed. In fact, they rejected the title deuterocanonical. Instead, they called these books apocrypha. Third, Protestant leaders had a profound differences in doctrine with Rome. Catholics sourced beliefs like purgatory and praying for the dead in the deuterocanonical books. So, by rejecting the books, Protestant leaders could reject the doctrines themselves. The Protestant Bible contains 39 books in the Old Testament, while the Tanakh lists 24. Why the difference? Simply put, Protestants broke down Tanakh books in the same way Catholics do. The Tanakh lists the minor prophets as one book, while Christian Bibles break them down into 12 separate books. Christians also split longer books found in the Tanakh into two. Samuel became 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel in Christian Bibles. Kings became 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Chronicles became 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah were separated by Christians into different books. So the three types of Christian Bibles reflect the tension between the Tanakh and the Septuagint. The Protestant Old Testament contains a version of the Tanakh. The Ecumenical Old Testament contains the Septuagint. The Roman Catholic Bible includes some, but not all of the Septuagint. To address modern English translations of the Bible, we must begin with the King James Version. There were other English translations at the time, but it was the first produced by a royal commission. King James wanted a Bible that reflected his position as leader of the Anglican Church, and one that emphasized the structure of bishops and clergy. In 1611, the first edition appeared, and it set the shape of the modern ecumenical Bible. The Tanakh in front, the New Testament in the back, and the additional books of the Septuagint in the middle. As printing presses allowed for a wider distribution of books, the King James became increasingly available. By 1769, its standard text dropped the middle section, leaving only the Tanakh and the New Testament. This version became the template for the modern Protestant Bible. Catholics also had an influential English translation, the Douay-Rheims Bible. It refers to the cities in France where it was first published. The New Testament appeared in Rheims about 1682, the Old Testament in Douay by 1610. While marginal notes referred to Hebrew and Greek sources, it was translated from the Latin Vulgate. The King James, however, was translated from the original Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Both translations were written in the rich prose of Elizabethan English. Both had a dramatic effect on future generations of readers. Over time, scholars updated the King James and Douay-Rheims Bibles for two reasons. Better resources came to light, and words changed meanings over time. This created a tension. Why should the translation try to be as literal as possible? Better resources help clarify the original language of the text. But does that help the reader understand a difficult passage? Instead, shouldn't the translation try to communicate the meaning of the text? This might help the reader's understanding, but at the possible cost of accuracy. So translators were forced with a dilemma. Do they translate the text word for word, also known as direct equivalence, or thought for thought, also known as dynamic equivalence? Even today, many translations are literal, but try to explain difficult passages in the marginal notes. Scholars have used one of the versions of the King James as the source and inspiration for a new translation. For example, we have the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, and the English Standard Version as descendants of the King James. These are more literal translations with notes for context. There are also many different revised versions of the King James. In the 1960s, American Catholic scholars set aside the Douay-Rheims. They translated afresh from the original Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Their efforts produced the New American Bible, the translation used for the Catholic liturgy in the United States. Like some of the translations already mentioned, it is a literal translation. At the same time, there was a push among scholars from different traditions for common translations. So editions appeared like the New Revised Standard Version for Catholics. There are even ecumenical Bibles in the form of the original King James. The Tanakh in the front, the New Testament in the back, the Septuagint in the middle. The New Revised Standard has such an edition. Today, there are over 60 different Bible translations in English alone. Obviously, there are different translations for different audiences. For example, one of the most popular translations in print is the New International Version. Evangelical scholars translated from Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic into a readable modern English. Unlike the other translations already mentioned, it leans towards a dynamic equivalence or thought-for-thought text. There are children's translations that also hew towards a dynamic equivalence, like the Contemporary English Version or the New International Reader's Version, a simpler text based upon the New International Version. Another popular translation of the Bible is not a direct translation at all, but a paraphrase. It's called The Message. It emphasizes narrative flow and context over literal translation. With all these different Bibles, which one's right for you? That depends upon how you use it. If you want to study the text, use a literal translation with extensive notes and commentary. If you want to pray the scriptures, you could use an easy-to-read translation for your devotion. If you want a Bible for group discussion, find one with discussion questions in the marginal notes. If you want to read the Bible to children, use a children's translation. These are only a few of the many Bible editions available today. These have different audiences and different uses, and we haven't even touched the resources available online. As Christians, we believe God inspired humans to write down His message. Today we have different translations and editions to give us that message. These different versions can give us insight into the cultures and problems of ancient peoples. They can also help us understand our culture and the problems we face. They even help us pass along our faith and values. Our dedication and use of scriptures reveals the flip side of inspiration. Yes, God sent His Spirit to breathe His message into ancient writers. But He also does the same for us when we study, pray over, and put His Word into action. In other words, divine inspiration gets results. Put God's Word into action. If you only listen to it and do nothing, you're fooling yourself.